My conclusions seem to be that ceteris paribus, assuming the structures of the region's economies are relatively constant, trade integration per se might actually be detrimental to the region, except it results in increased volumes of exports, improved terms of trade. Improved volumes of exports and improved terms of trade. So I'm saying ceteris paribus, holding these things constant, it seems as though trade integration with North America could actually be detrimental to the region. I'm not suggesting that this will actually be detrimental. I'm saying it's a ceteris paribus argument. And it is reasonable to expect with integration that trade volumes will increase and that the terms of trade might improve. Therefore, we will not see deteriorations from integration with North America, but the ceteris paribus argument I thought needed to be pointed out at the very beginning. And we'll discuss the results of that in a moment. So I start with the traditional production function, and then I augment it by including real export volumes. There is a vast literature which says that if goods that are produced for exports are indeed produced more efficiently, if resources used in the export sectors are utilized more efficiently than resources used in the domestic or non-tradable sectors, then we could actually have some efficiency gains. We expect that increased levels of capital and increased levels of labor inputs should lead to increased levels of output. I've redefined my dependent variable in this model as per capita output. So I'm saying that we might expect increased levels of capital and increased levels of exports to ceteris paribus, in each case, lead to increased levels of output. There is an argument that goods that are produced, manufacturing exports are generally use resources more efficiently than primary exports. I have not bought into the argument wholesale, but it seems that there's a lot of people who have suggested that manufacturing exports contribute more to domestic output, gross domestic product, than primary exports. The terms of trade variable that I just stumbled over. Some of you might not buy it. In fact, I've had a hard time trying to sell this argument to an academic journal, but it seems as though, to me, improved terms of trade, if it leads to increased levels of foreign exchange and increased levels of GNP, should have a way of increasing real output. People have more money in their pockets, therefore they end up finding new things to do with this money. If they're going to spend it, as long as they don't spend it on exports, if they spend some of it on the domestic production, it could reasonably lead to increased levels of real output. For those of you who are not statistically inclined, I guess I'll just verbally summarize and not look at the numbers here. I'll tell you the data you're looking at are elasticities on the particular variables, and the numbers in parentheses are t-scores, in which case we know that anything above 2.0 is in the ballpark of being acceptable. We accept the alternative hypothesis and conclude that the variable is statistically significant. If you had to run down the px and pz columns, I should tell you what countries I'm looking at here. At the very bottom of the page, I define all of the countries except I missed one, which was Haiti, and that's number 3, HT, Haiti. So if you had to run down one of the columns, you'll be asking the question, how does an increase, for example, a 1% increase in real exports for the column number, well, the second column, the export column, how does a 1% increase in real export volumes influence output in these countries? The highest coefficient that is statistically significant would suggest that that country seems to have benefited in the period 1967 to 1987 more than others. I'm going to start with the terms of trade variable P sub x and P sub z. If you run down the column there, you'll recognize that the highest coefficient is a 0.66, which is for Jamaica. And here is my interpretation of that. I have one extra copy of the table in case somebody else is having a hard time. There you go. The 0.66 suggests that the highest elasticity or responsiveness to terms of trade improvements or deteriorations occurs in Jamaica. I interpret that to say that when the terms of trade in Jamaica improved by 3%, say, it contributed to a 2% increase in real output, ceteris paribus. Whereas if you looked at the smallest significant number occurring in equation 4 for Costa Rica, I'm suggesting that in order to get the same 2% increase in real output from the terms of trade, you would have to have a 20% improvement in the terms of trade for Costa Rica. Clearly, those of you who are familiar with these countries will understand how the structures will result in a greater price responsiveness, a greater output responsiveness to price in these countries. Without knowing too much about some of the countries, and basically you can see that I'm more statistical and somehow don't necessarily go out and study all the structures of the economy first. I have a general theory and I wanted to test it, and then I'll go to see which countries deviate from what I expected and then try to interpret them on that basis. Why should the coefficient for Jamaica be so high? In other words, how do we interpret it? To me, it seems to be that if Jamaica depended more on primary exports than some of these other countries, certainly we know that in that period bauxite was a very important export for Jamaica, and that the price of bauxite was also very volatile. We explain via this coefficient what was happening in Jamaica. We see that it seems that the improved terms of trade in Jamaica contributed to positive growth, whereas every time the terms of trade deteriorated, Jamaica was hurt, ceteris paribus. If you look at the first column, the export volume column, you recognize that, again, the coefficients are relatively similar except for Haiti and Mexico, which were both statistically insignificant. What this tells me is that increased volumes of exports in Haiti and Mexico did not, ceteris paribus, lead to increased levels of real output. The question then arose, so what contributed to growth in these countries if it was not increased volumes of real exports as for all the other countries? If you look in the very last column, you will see by capital variable, and you will see that for most of the countries, again, the capital variable was very statistically significant. Certainly for the two countries I just referred to, Haiti and Mexico, you'll recognize that the T statistics for those two countries were much higher than for any of the other countries, and it seems to me to suggest that increases in capital were had a greater influence on increases in real output than in some of the other countries. I should also interpret the size of the coefficients. Can anyone hear me at all? We have competition from two ends now. Okay, I'll continue and assume that you're hearing what I'm saying, okay? You'll notice that I didn't get any statistically significant coefficients for Dominican Republic, which is in equation 1, and Costa Rica in equation 4, under the capital variable. I know that many people are skeptical about all of this. I can see some looks of skepticism out there. But the argument that I really wanted to make, the purpose you are here, is the column X sub A on X. What did I do? I asked the question, in the period 1967 to 1987, ceteris paribus, remember it's a ceteris paribus argument, did increasing our trade, for the 7 countries I have here, did increasing their trade with the US, ceteris paribus, lead to improvements in the levels of output? If I had a positive sign on the coefficient, the answer would be yes. I got a negative sign on all the coefficients except for the coefficient for Haiti. It is true that the coefficient for Jamaica was statistically insignificant, and I was pushing it a little bit with the coefficient for El Salvador. But the conclusion of that particular table seems to be that, ceteris paribus, increasing your trade with the US did not result in increased levels of real output. We're not suggesting, again, that trading more with the US was hurting these countries, because there are other factors that were important. Certainly increased levels of capital or increased volumes of exports. But if the countries were, if you could understand or imagine a regime where you're taking your given level of exports and switching more of it towards the US, we see here that these countries were not getting greater growth. And obviously the question you are asking is, well, why? Why not? Can you explain that? The explanation seems to me to be that if we were trading more of what are considered offshore manufacturing goods with the US, we were not adding nearly as much value to the products because most of the inputs were coming in from overseas. So when you look at the export numbers, you were seeing increased volumes of exports, but these weren't necessarily exports that originated in the various countries. A large part of the problem might have been that many of the countries in the Caribbean, when they measure their exports, would actually say we are exporting this volume of goods without telling you that the net exports is very small. We are saying this is what we're exporting, but most of it might have been imported upfront. So that if you just looked at the data the way I did, you would see that there was a negative contribution from increasing your trade with the US. So if, for those people who look at the numbers from a different perspective, I don't think I'll go on much longer because I don't know if I can take the competition. If you looked at a lot of the analyses, looking at the data, would miss the point that increasing our trade with the US, ceteris paribus, does not or has not in that period led to increased levels of real output. What I would say is that we have to look for a way to make sure that integrating into the US economy will actually lead to increased volumes of trade and improved terms of trade. In the absence of these two phenomena, increased volumes of trade, improved terms of trade, and certainly for the capital variable, increased levels of capital, and in this case I think it's largely foreign capital. Unless these three factors are present, it does not seem to me that integrating with the US will be a good idea. I'm not, again, for one moment suggesting that integration into the US or the North American economy will hurt the region, but we are just saying that unless the region can pull itself up to improve either its level of real output or to ensure that it gets more capital or it can get improved terms of trade, there does not seem to be a lot of benefit to be had. I'm going to stop there rather than be stopped. I have other tables that you can look at and I'm available to discuss some of the findings. Should I stop or do I have enough? I have been stopped, I can see.
Okay, thank you very much.